It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker and his book. Professor Liyanage Amarakeerthi from University of Peradeniya will be taking us through his book, Karmic Realism, Narrative Methods in Sinhala Prose from the Buddhist Classics to Post-realist Fiction. And chairing today's session is Professor Charles Hallisey from Harvard University, who will guide us through the discussion and moderate the Q&A segment. Over to you, Professor Hallisey, to introduce today's speaker.
So, thank you very much, Ranmali. So it's a convention of introductions at academic events such as this one for the person introducing the speaker to say that the speaker needs no introduction. That is certainly the case this morning or this evening, but at the same time, I do not want to deny myself the pleasure of introducing Professor Liyanage Amarakeerthi, who I have known for almost a quarter of a century now, and my life has been the better because of my relationship with him. Professor Liyanage Amarakeerthi is professor in the Department of Sinhala at the University of Peradeniya, where he has taught since 2008. He is a prolific writer. He is the author of more than 20 books, and he has won the National Literary Award in Sri Lanka twice, and he has also received the Swarna Pustaka Award for his fiction. He is perhaps best known for his fiction, but he is also a poet, a translator, a literary critic, and a major figure in literary studies in Sri Lanka, which his new book entitled Karmic Realism attests to. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Liyanage Amarakeerthi.
Thank you, Professor Hallisey, and everyone. Thank you for organizing this seminar. By the way, we were hoping the book would come out end of January or middle of January, but because of some technical issues, like mechanical issues, like printing machines breaking or something, the publication of the book delayed. The book might come out tomorrow, like in couple of days. I hope you can see the presentation. This is the book coming out of my doctoral research, my PhD work that I did with my Guruji, Professor Charles Hallisey. And he has been asking me to publish this for many years, but I have been kind of putting it off and writing some other books in Sinhala and some other stuff in English. But then again, it is good that it got delayed, the publication, I mean. During the last several years, I could work further on it, and my ideas, some of the ideas expressed in the book kind of matured, and I also matured as a person. Therefore, I think it's all right that book, the publication of the book got delayed. This book, oops, that's it. Yeah. When I entered the graduate school in University of Wisconsin, I wanted to look into what literature means in Buddhist studies. I entered the University of Wisconsin in 1998. Professor Hallisey was still at Harvard those days. He joined the University of Wisconsin in year 2000, I guess, yes. 2 years before I was there. Even then, I was thinking of, studying Sinhala classics, Buddhist classics, and modern Sinhala literature. It's a part of Buddhist culture. So I was approaching a literary tradition with kind of comparative literature, theoretical point of view. Then Professor Hallisey came to University of Wisconsin, became my supervisor and my guru. Then under his guidance, I worked on my doctoral stuff, and then we did so many other things together. And at Wisconsin, I was studying literary theories, narrative theories with professors from comparative literature, Asian studies, anthropology, many fields. It's a kind of holistic degree program at Wisconsin. Therefore, I wanted to study Sinhala classical prose narratives from the perspective of narrative theory, modern narrative theory. Therefore, in this book, in my research, Buddhist literature, South Asian literature, classical Asian literature, and contemporary Western narrative theory, literary theory come together, kind of supplementing each other. The book has these chapters. Second and third chapter are about these two classical Buddhist narrative books. Amavatura is a prose narrative book written roughly in 13th century, Buddhasarana, same time period, two different styles. And then I'm looking at this, what does it mean to be literary in classical literature? What does that idea of literariness has to do with what is understood as literature in modern times, contemporary times, so in our times. Then I take this literary theoretical, narrative theoretical perspective on this plot and character of the Vesantara narrative, last chapter of this second book, Buddhasarana, written in the 13th century. Then analyze it as a work of narrative art. Then I go into, this is the central kind of thematic central chapter is Karmic Realism. This how this Buddhist idea of causality is used in narrative literature. Then I try to bridge a certain gap in narrative theoretical studies in Sinhala, in Sri Lanka, the Sinhala literary field. That is how to use this classical Buddhist narratives and then the modes of narrative storytelling found in those narratives, how to examine those narrative methods in contemporary narrative theoretical terms. Then I look at this idea of post-realism. What I mean by this idea, the term post-realism, is all the methods, all the techniques or styles or narrative modes that are trying to go beyond this naturalist realism. Those are basically the plan of the book. This book has these two elements, two dimensions. One is literary theoretical dimension. The other is literary historical dimensions. Those two dimensions supplement each other throughout the book. I will explain how and why they complement each other. One of the debates that happened in the early 20th century in Sri Lanka this is where this book has sort of post-colonial theoretical currency, if you will, or meaning or significance or relevance, that there's this debate about origin of modern Sinhala fiction. This slide doesn't really do justice to the idea. Modern Sinhala fiction in Sri Lanka. Some people argued that modern fiction, novel, short story, was borrowed from the West, and we borrowed it during the colonial encounter, particularly during the British colonial time. Some other people would argue that nope, we didn't borrow it from anyone. Sinhala Buddhist literary history always had not modern, fiction. What can be called short story or novels. But when they made that argument, I don't mention the names. One particular name, like prominent name, is Martin Wickramasinghe. When they made that argument, they said that realism was not anything new for Buddhist culture, because kind of the Buddhist worldview is very realistic, very cause and effect, mundanely rationalist, logical. Therefore, we did not have to borrow realism or realist fiction from the West, because Buddhism is a very rational philosophy or religion. Then, towards the end of the 20th century, another debate or discourse happened that is about post-realism. That is, that literary writers and critics felt that naturalist realism was so rigid, so strict, that it cannot represent complex realities of the late 20th century Sri Lankan life. Many writers, critics felt that the naturalist realism in fiction has become kind of like a tired. It couldn't surprise the reader anymore. Therefore, Sinhala literary culture needed some sort of post-realism. During that time, during that debate, that discourse, the idea of magic realism came into Sinhala literary culture with the translation of some fiction by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Milan Kundera. Salman Rushdie's work was not translated, but he was mentioned in literary critical discussion. All those magic realists were regularly, routinely mentioned by the end of 20th century. When that happened, the classical Buddhist literature made a kind of comeback, right? Especially the very non-realist elements or supernaturalist elements, so-called magical elements in classical Buddhist literature. Buddhist literature was full of them, actually. They came back. They made a comeback. Those elements were, early 20th century, those elements were ignored because they were not very realist. Little bit too fabulous, too wonderful, too fantastic to be part of the naturalist realist discourse. Now, with the magic realism, those elements, are you with me on that? Those kind of like supernaturalist elements came back into the discourse. Then I thought, there is some way to create new bridges, new connections between classical Buddhist literature and this post-realism. But I had this conceptual or theoretical or cultural, you can put it in any way you want, issue to deal with. That is, what is often called magic realist or marvelous real in the West or Latin America or Eastern Europe might not necessarily be magical in Sinhala culture, right? Can magic realism be magical in all cultures? That was one of the questions that I had. This book, I think, makes a kind of considerable effort to deal with this issue. Now, let me give you this example from two famous narratives. Actually, one is quite famous. One is the story of Remedio the Beauty. That's in 100 Years of Solitude, Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Remedio the Beauty. Remedio is obviously beautiful, young woman. She is attending to regular daily chores in broad daylight. Regular day, regular Colombian day. She has washed the clothes. She was hanging them on the clothes line to dry. Immediately, she grows two pair of wings from her shoulders. She flies into the sky and ascends to the heaven. Now, some other people, some other characters are looking at the Remedios flying into heaven. It is accepted, magical, right? This regular, mundane, secular day. Nothing magical, supernatural about that day, that space. She goes into the heaven. Now, this is a wonderful example of magic realism. Speaking about that, that kind of magical events, Svetan Todorov said, when magic realism proper happens, the reader would hesitate between two explanations. One is supernatural explanation. The other is more secular, mundane, everyday explanation, more realistic explanation. How did Remedio the Beauty go into the heaven? Right? You can come up with some scientific or secular interpretation. And you can come up with supernatural explanation. Some sort of divine supernatural intervention took her into the heaven. That the Todorov says the reader would hesitate between these two explanations. That moment of hesitation, the oscillation between these two explanations is an aesthetic experience, quite magical. That his explanation, talking about magic realism. Now let me go back to this Buddhist story, Manduka Divyaputra. Manduka is frog. Divyaputra, son of God, some godling. This is from that one of the books I mentioned earlier, Buddhism. There, this Buddha is preaching Dharma. He is teaching in India, one of the monasteries. This cowboy is listening to the Buddha's teaching. And he has these buffaloes with him. They are also listening. Buddha's preaching was so sweet that everyone wants to listen to it. Then the cowboy has brought his cows to this river. He is listening to the Buddha's preaching, like standing on this river bank. The Buddha's preaching was so sweet, even frogs, fish, everyone wants to listen to that teaching or preaching. Frogs understand it in frog language, fish understand it in fish language. The Buddha's preaching was so captivating that this cowboy has this stick in his hand. He drops that stick on one of the frogs listening to Buddha's preaching. This frog dies right there because the stick hits hard him, and he immediately goes into the heaven, Tusita heaven, transformed into a Divyaputra God. And right there, from the heaven, he looks down at India, this particular city. He sees his own frog body on the beach, on the bank of the river. Still, the cowboy is listening. Still, Buddha is preaching. Now he is in Tusita heaven, up there. Immediately goes there. That not only that the transformation is the frog transformed into a god, spatially too, right? In terms of space, from the earth, he is going into immediately, instantly goes into the heaven. That's even more magical than Remedios the Beauty of 100 years of solitude going into the heaven, ascending to heaven. But the second story, Buddhist story, yes, magical, but the explanation is karmic, right? As Todoro suggested, typical Buddhist reader might not hesitate between two explanations. He would he or she would interpret it as karmic effect. It is karma. Because at the moment of his death, the frog was listening to the Buddha's preach. At the moment of his departure, or Chuti Sita, the mind, his mind, when he died, he was full of devotion towards the Buddha. That's karma. Okay, that's one. I can give you like all kinds of narrative explanations. Now I thought that in Sinhala Buddhist narratives and many other narratives, karma, in addition to being the abhidharmic category, very philosophical category, it is a narrative category as well. It's a form of causality that gives explanation to the narrative events. It's a form of causality that connects two narrative events or two or more narrative events together. In Buddhist literature, therefore, the narrative mode of karma is a literary mode. That's what I call karmic realism. The book is basically about how this mode can be used, has been used. Then towards the end of the book, I talk about several contemporary writers, some of them are still writing. They are working on this, what I call post-realist mode, magic realist, or narratives with very supernatural, magical elements in them. I am asking or suggesting can we explain those narratives in terms of karmic realism? Then in the book, I do talk about some limits of karmic realism, because when realism came into being, and it became very popular mode of explanation, popular mode of causality in the late 19th century. So one of the strengths of it is it can give socio-historical explanations of human behavior. Human consciousness, historically constructed. Human behavior as social, psychological, historical explanations and dimensions. We can still retain those elements, and how we kind of create a synthesis of realism and the idea of karma in narratives. That's why I didn't want to drop the idea of realism. I didn't want to call it karmism. I want to call it karmic realism. That's basically, I think, the gist of the book. I guess I will stop without taking too much time. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much, Amarakeerthi. I have the benefit of everyone on this call to having had a chance to read Professor Liyanage's book, Karmic Realism. So let me just say to everyone else that you have something to look forward to. That the book is really a quite striking achievement. And I could say that it's a striking achievement in very large-scale things and also in its details. With respect to the large-scale things, I would say that what is very striking about the book is that it helps us to reconsider and in some cases to go beyond entrenched divides that we tend to do various kinds of studies in the humanities and the social sciences. A divide between the pre-colonial and the colonial and the post-colonial, a divide between the pre-modern and the modern, a divide between Buddhist studies and literary studies, a divide between works written in Pali and works written in Sinhala. And with respect to all of these divides, they're acknowledged by Professor Liyanage, but then also set aside and alternative ways of approaching the material without using those divides that he explores. I can also say that on almost every page of the book, there is some gem that I found myself pausing over, thinking, writing down, reflecting on. And so I want to encourage everyone to be on the lookout for what in contemporary American idiom people refer to as Easter eggs, these hidden things that are waiting as surprises and pleasures to discover. Some of them are the text of his, just to say the footnotes are remarkable pieces of interventions into large-scale debates at times, drawing our attention to the work of previous scholars, the contemporary scholars, but just making all kinds of really interesting asides and interventions for all of us to kind of engage, explore, think further, and continue. Let me say that from my own point of view, there's two large-scale vectors that are organizing the book. One is the study of the narrative techniques of primarily four writers, two, we might say, classical or pre-modern, and two modern writers. Professor Liyanage has concentrated on, in his comments just now, on the two pre-modern authors, Guru Lugami and Vijay Chakravartin. Guru Lugami, the author of Amavatra, and also Dharma Pradipika, and Vijay Chakravartin, the author of Bodhisadhana, as well as Daham Sadhana, and perhaps Sangha Sadhana. you might say that a divide of dealing with these four writers would be that the classical writers, Guru Lugami and Vijay Chakravartin, we tend to interpret within categories like mythic or religious categories. Whereas the two modern writers, Simon Navagattegama and Ajit Tilakasena, we tend to, like Professor Liyanage just was doing, interpret them in terms of something, a literary movement that can be called post-realist and compared to magical realism that has become globalized from Latin America. There is another large-scale vector that is concerned with realism in literature. Professor Liyanage refers to this as a vector that is, we might say, concerned, that is a literary theoretical one, in the sense that it takes up issues of what realism is in literature, and indeed what reality is in literature. I can say that this combination of the two vectors, focusing on individual works and then having large-scale theoretical issues, means that part of the excitement of reading Karmic Realism for me is listening to the echoes that Professor Liyanage sets up when he juxtaposes a pre-modern text with a modern one. And we start to see aspects of the pre-modern text that I don't think we have recognized before. We're seeing a Bodhisattva and an Amawatara that has not been presented to us otherwise. And we're also seeing a way of taking contemporary literary movements like post-realism in connection to pre-modern things in ways that generally have not been explored before either. Now, one of the things of the turn to the questions of the literary theoretical issues, the concern of what is realism in literature, what is reality in literature, means that what Professor Liyanage does is that he engages in a kind of comparative study about literature in general. And in his preface, he opens up the Karmic Realism by saying that comparative literature is not truly comparative unless it pays close attention to theoretical assumptions that underlie the literary works being compared. In other words, beyond thematic and content level comparisons, one must probe into what makes certain texts highlighting literature in a specific literary culture. Such investigations lead to the discovery of epistemologies that exist unseen beneath literary works. So I just want to emphasize this idea of the argument in Karmic Realism that a primary concern is with these unseen epistemologies that are informing both the pre-modern works of Amawatara and Bodhisattva and the modern post-realist works of Navagattegama and Tilakasena. And to just see that this unseen epistemology in some ways is stretching across what we usually consider as a very deep rupture between the pre-colonial and the colonial, or the pre-modern and the modern. Now, there's a way of kind of continuing introducing the book Karmic Realism, but also to raise some thoughts and share some questions that I have to Professor Liyanage. I just want to observe that the focus on these two writers, Guru Lugami and Vijay Chakravartin, is an important focus. They are writing close in time to each other. Both are writing biographies of the Buddha, Buddha Charita. But there is a striking difference between the two of them. The way I would put it is that Guru Lugami, as Professor Liyanage draws our attention to, writes in three different styles of Sinhala. The style of Amawatara, that probably has no anything to compare to in Sinhala literature in terms of its the literary language that is used. And then different styles that are in his other work, Dharma Pratipika. Whereas Vijay Chakravartin only wrote in a single style. So in terms of an unseen epistemology, is one of these. Guru Lugami, who was able to write in different styles, and in this he seems close to what is in Dundan's Kavyadarsha, but not in Siyabhas Lakara, that there's different kind of paths, different ritis of literature that are possible, in which he does embrace both of those. One that is simple, straightforward. The other that is learned and Baroque, kind of like the difference between Latinate English and Anglo-Saxon English. That Guru Lugami seems to understand that. Whereas Vijay Chakravartin only writes in a style that we would say is a kind of Latinate Sinhala, very Sanskritic at times. So the question is whether there is an unseen epistemology in the pre-modern literary culture that is encouraging to write in different styles, or one that the Sinhala literary culture is, say, more or less uncomfortable with, and that Vijay Chakravartin is more typical than Guru Lugami is. But this idea of unseen epistemologies as being important in a literary culture, I think, is a large-scale contribution of Karmic Realism. What it means for me, though, is that in the case of looking at style, how do we connect attention to this unseen epistemology with what seems to be conscious choices? The unseen epistemology is something that is shaping how people act and write as literary figures. Whereas a conscious choice is how people, in some sense, do things that are unusual outside of this unseen epistemology. It's along the lines of the famous line from Marx in the 18th Brumaire, that humans make history, but not in conditions of their own making. The unseen epistemology is conditions not of their own making, but then both Vijay Chakravartin and Guru Lugami make conscious choices in terms of how they write. There's also another conscious choice of practice for literary figures in the pre-modern times, and that has to do with illusions. And so one of the questions on whether we see in like pre-modern Sinhala prose anything like the exuberant allusions that are made to other works that we see in Sinhala poetry continually, that people are constantly making allusions to remind their readers of something that is relevant to the work at hand, that is depending on readers recognizing the allusion. So that is just a question about how to deal with these two vectors, focusing on individual authors and then also on realism and karmic realism. They focus on two kinds of phenomena. One is about unseen epistemologies. The other is on individual authors. And in a certain sense, questions about how best to combine these two vectors when studying any individual work in which both the author and the unseen epistemology is present. One of the unusual things about Guru Lugami and Vijay Chakravartin compared to Navagattegama and Tilakasena is the place of translation in the work of Guru Lugami and Vijay Chakravartin. In Karmic Realism, Professor Liyanage shows how they are attending, these two Sinhala authors are attending to work precedents in Pali, and in some sense are engaged in something that could be called translation. So it's a question for me is that how does translation become a variable in this kind of unseen epistemology? And should we see, say, the works of post-realism in modern Sri Lanka as another form of translation between magical realism and Sinhala literary culture? Another large-scale question I want to just raise is what Professor Liyanage's attention to this unseen epistemology that stretches across the epistemic ruptures of pre-modern and modern, or colonial and pre-colonial and colonial, is something that quite a number of people have been interested in. Of how is it that continuities persist, perdure across these ruptures? Anne Blackburn has done this within Buddhist studies in her book Locations of Buddhism. John Rogers has done it in his own historical works about the continuities of things in terms of the larger history of Sri Lanka. But one of the issues that we might wonder about is whether this interest in continuities across the ruptures of the pre-modern and the modern and pre-colonial and colonial, that there is something of an emergent disposition to what we might call some sort of nationalism. That definitely was the case in terms of the work earlier of Martin Wickramasinghe, who wanted to argue that evaluating a realism in Sinhala literature didn't depend on the introduction of a European genre like the novel, but was already present in pre-modern Sinhala writing. But that was in the service of a large-scale nationalist agenda, perhaps, that was, it seemed, something that was both necessary and something that was more or less self-evident to people writing in the 1950s. But the question I have is whether this attention to unseen epistemologies that stretch across epistemic ruptures, whether that they automatically produce a disposition to something that might be comparable to nationalism. And if so, how do we modulate that disposition? So with that, let me just turn it back to Professor Liyanage, and then after he responds, if he has any response to my comments, we can open it up to questions from everyone who is here.
Yeah, and the last point was really interesting one, especially even when I was writing this book or conducting research about this, when I was going to argue that what I called the narrative mode of idea of karma, the karma being used as a mode of storytelling, mode of causality, to claim that that we had this our own culture specific kind of cultural relativist idea of causality might sound like epistemological nationalism, right? That challenge, how to face that challenge. Therefore, I have argued in this book that Sinhala literary culture has been quite cosmopolitan, borrowing all kinds of isms, if you will, all kinds of art forms, all kinds of forms of causality. Sinhala, at least one trend of aesthetic consciousness in Sinhala culture is so agile, so flexible that it can hold together both cause and effect naturalist realism and karmic realism. That flexibility is something we have to be safeguarded. We have to safeguard. We have to kind of theoretically defend, right? Therefore, it's not what Wickramasinghe, for understandable reasons, what he did in 50s, in several of his books actually, in Buddhist Jatakata Vimasuma, his analysis of Jataka stories, he claimed that we didn't have to borrow, say, rationalism from Hume or anyone. Buddhism itself was very rational, and we didn't need any European Enlightenment thinkers, because Buddhism itself was, Buddha himself was an Enlightenment thinker. That kind of argument. That argument can end up being very nationalist, philosophically at least, or epistemologically. The difficulty is to create a space for that, what I would call aesthetic diversity, aesthetic cosmopolitanism, which is something we had arguably in the time of Guru Lugomi and Vidya Chakravarti. In that same century, at least 4 modes of writing narratives in prose existed. Guru Lugomi represented at least 3, Vidya Chakravarti 1, we were very, very cosmopolitan, really. The other thing, the idea of translation. In the first part of the book, I kind of closely compare Pali versions. By the way, I studied Pali with Professor Hallisey, and I could translate some Pali from some Pali into English and Sinhala. So I wanted to compare it, see it myself, how some canonical Pali was translated by Guru Lugomi. For one thing, those days idea of translation, I don't think did mean the same thing as it does today. It's a very different idea of translation. As Tagore once said, like any cultural thing, once we borrow and use it, it becomes our own. Rabindranath Tagore once said. Similarly, Guru Lugomi seemed to have thought that way. Even there, he did something very creative when he translated, put some canonical stuff in Sinhala. Very, very creative to create some aesthetic effect for characterization, some situations, some in theoretical terms, you can say affective use. The kind of affect, kind of emotions you want to create in the reader. That's not kind of direct translation, kind of his own way of using a language. Yeah, I will stop there without too much time. By the way, thank you for hidden epistemology. Yeah, one more thing. It is these epistemologies, what I call aesthetic epistemology, is hidden. They are hidden in several ways. One, key reason to say it is hidden, we don't have classical manual for writing. No theoretical treatise for writing prose in classical Sinhala. Therefore, this art of prose or aesthetics of prose are hidden in the texts themselves. One of the challenges for scholars is to uncover those hidden theories of prose in these texts. Hidden epistemologies in that sense. Yeah.
So we have about 10 more minutes left in our session. So if people have questions they want to address to Professor Liyanage, that they can raise their hand on the Zoom tools, and then I'll try to react to people as best I can, but I'm not sure I can see everyone. So, Shana, if you maybe turn on your camera.
Hi, thank you so much. Really
Hi, Professor.
interesting. Hi, Amarakeerthi, so nice to see you. And thank you so much for really, really interesting talk and also Professor Hallisey's comments. I just want to play devil's advocate for a moment and raise the particular question about karmic realism. If karma implies multiple lives and reincarnation, how does one fit that into a notion of realism? Is my question clear?
Yeah. I see. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Right. I will, in this particular book, I don't mention this. This is Najib Mahfouz, the Egyptian writer, had this wonderful novel called Harafish. So, about 300 pages. In that, about 5 generations of people in the same place, city. It's a kind of a big novel. The people are reborn again, again and again in 5 generations of people. In terms of characterization, like for example, X person, if it is reborn and reborn in several generations, that X would be kind of same kind of character, same life, right? This very different idea of characterization. Then another example that Professor Hallisey, I actually studied with Professor Hallisey. That's this Japanese writer, uh, the um, the writer who killed himself, Harakiri.
Uh,
the
so Yukio Mishima.
Yukio Mishima's novel, there's a trilogy. In the trilogy, same character is reborn, right? Mr. Honda, and he is married to this lady, and they are also they become husband and wife in 3 lives, 4 lives actually. In one time, uh, the wife is born in a family in Thailand. The Japanese husband, the third life, I think, he finds out that his former wife now has been reborn in Thailand. He goes there, finds, then the Mr. Honda's life is portrayed throughout 4 lives. This we have to kind of accept that our life is much larger, longer than this the calendar year or our regular mundane lifetime, right? That is real. Then in historical terms, if we take literally realism, very naturalist, very rational way, you cannot accept that understanding of life. Yes, there's a debate. It's an interesting and the rewarding debate in narrative art, I guess. Thank you.
Are there other comments or questions? Praveen.
Thank you, Professor Amarakeerthi, for this great talk. And also, thank you for your work. I've benefited from your Easter eggs quite a lot. And I'm excited to see this, to read this as a book, hopefully soon. I vaguely remember the dissertation version. My question is like I was hoping you could talk a bit more about realism and like also alongside realism, things like reality and real, like these linked ideas. Um, Especially in terms of like whether we can think about the idea of realism, like whether we can think about like a genealogy of thinking about realism from within Sinhala literature and intellectual history and stuff like that. Because, and the reason I ask this question is because I'm studying the so-called Peradini Gurukula, and technically, if we, I mean, look at it through the, I mean, Ajit Tilakasena and Navagat Begum as post-realist and things that precede that as realist, then there is something, for instance, around the debates around Peradini literature where there's constantly this term being contested. And so realism always seems to be this term that's contested. On the one hand, nobody is realist enough at any given point. And at the same time, nobody completely relinquishes realism. But also there's ideas of like, is the psyche, especially with like psychological fiction, can the psyche operate according to like realist principles? If so, where should realism be located? But also even things like Sarat Chandra's like Kalpanaloke, and questions as to whether that was opposed to realism. So I'm curious to hear what you think about like this kind of like genealogy of like the term and how it has been deployed in relation to this later moment that would more obviously mark its difference from like realist modes of narration. I don't know if that makes sense, but I
Yes,
hope you
yes.
more.
Especially Sri Lankan genealogy, it's really interesting one. Arguably, um, now in the West, you can say like literary modernism as a reaction to literary realism. That is, the literary realism is little too rigid to write about contemporary times, especially modern times, especially in uh, narrativizing human psyche, going into the interior landscape of human beings. Realism, naturalist realism is so limited. Therefore, the modernism came in. In Sri Lankan genealogy, I think realism itself was quite modernist, arguably, because we needed that time. Some people think that in short fiction, the most successful short fiction, realist short fiction, is found in Martin Wickramasinghe's 1924 collection, Gahanya. And the same people argue that the best realist novel, Wickramasinghe's 1944, Gamperaliya, translated there, has been translated as Uprooted, I think. In those fictional work, realism is quite modernist because they were trying to move away from very we had two words those days in Sinhala, one called Tathvikavada. It is basically, you can translate it as a naturalism rather than realism. Some people who defended Wickramasinghe's realism thought that Wickramasinghe moved away from Tathvikavada, naturalism, brought in this very historicist explanation of, or Marxist or explanation of society, social dimension of human life, the historical causality of human life. If you think that way, even realism was quite revolutionary, modernist. Then during 1950s and 60s with Peradeniya school, Peradeniya Gurukulaya, modernism came with Siriguna Singh and others, with the influence of Pound, Virginia Woolf, Joyce, and all that, going into the interior landscape, inner psyche of modern contemporary or the post-colonial Sinhala person, you will, or colonial Sinhala person, investigating how Sinhala mind works. And those people thought that realism was not good enough to do that. Stream of consciousness as a technique was needed. That the popularity of that kind of modernism didn't last that long. Like by 70s, socialist realism came, Janata Sahitya, people's literature came. Pretty much actually arguably destroyed all the achievements of modernist writers of Iran. That's cool. And went into very propagandist socialist type, very Soviet Union type literature. Janata Sahitya, people's literature came in. You know, then people, the writers, critics got tired of that. Then very rich debate about post-realism came in. I think that we are still in that discourse. In terms of genealogy, now we are in some ways, even most realist writers are post-realist these days. Someone like myself could write in realism, but when I need, I would move away from that naturalist, very rigid kind of realism, go into the world of imagination, go into some magic realist elements, if you. I think now that flexibility of realism, agility of realism in Sinhala fiction right now is a good one. I guess everywhere in the world too, kind of learned writers, good writers, work that way, I think, using shrewdly the limits of realism. The kind of realism they're writing is not that very naturalist, the scientific logical realism that we found in some early 20th century or some very, very commercial type now. Yeah, took quite a bit of time, sorry.
So we're out of time, so let me turn it over to Ranmali to bring our session, a very stimulating session, to a close.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you all very much for joining us today. My sincere thanks to Professor Amarakeerthi and Professor Hallisey for their insightful contribution and for guiding today's discussion. So our next book talk will take place on 9th March. Bruno Shirley will discuss his book, Religion, Gender and Politics in Medieval Sri Lanka, the Reconstruction of Buddhist Kingship. Please note that daylight saving time in the United States begins on 8th March. So the US time for this session will be 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, 1 hour ahead of today's US time. This change applies only to US time zones. Further details and registration information will be shared through AILS social media channels. So thank you once again, and we hope to see you at our next session.